welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Alexander Mikaberidze, author of The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, published by Oxford University Press, February 10th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure and honor to be back.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing on the Napoleonic Wars?
As far as I remember myself, I've been interested in history. Initially in history of my own home, my homeland, Georgia. And then at about the age of 10, I stumbled upon a biography of Napoleon. And that biography, like in many cases, just bewitched me, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The story of Napoleon's birth, his rise to power, his exploits. I think it had this romantic aura of it that fascinates so many people. And I was so mesmerized by it that I tried to find more books about it, which was not particularly easy task to do in early 1990s Georgia, amidst the war and economic crisis and complete misery. But I think during those years of hardship, reading about Napoleon and reading about French Revolution, I think sustained me and allowed me to just really observe events from a different point of view. And I remember spending nights as war was raging in downtown Tbilisi, where I was living at the time, and reading about the events of the terror and then events of Vendemier of 1795 and Napoleon's rise to power. Gradually then I focused more and more on exploring history. And even though I didn't plan to become a professional historian, I actually did my first degree in law. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I decided to make a switch and pursue a PhD in history, specializing in Napoleonic history.
Mm-hmm. And now you know a number of languages, is that correct?
I do. I think that's not a particularly unusual thing for a European. I know in America it is a bit unusual to speak more than 2 or 3 languages, but I do. I was born and raised in Soviet Union, so although I'm an ethnic Georgian and Georgian is my native tongue, I was certainly taught the Russian from an early childhood, so I'm quite fluent in it. And I also picked up along the way English and French, and I have a working knowledge of Latin and Italian with a smattering of Polish and Bulgarian and other languages, certainly enough just to conduct research in it. Mm-hmm. Which have been quite useful in my own studies.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I asked the question, because it does help with your research, I assumed. Let's talk about the book has a grand scope, the entire history of the Napoleonic Wars, 1792 to 1815, I guess, including the Revolution. How did you, with all the material out there already, how did you break it down? How did you make this different from the other histories that are out there?
I think I approached it from, first of all, from a different point of view, and then I organized it in a slightly different way. So Napoleonic Wars is one of the most researched and written about period of modern history. Every year you see publications that explore some element of it. But the vast majority, I would say almost all of the titles that appear are Eurocentric. So that is, they focus on events in Europe. And more than that, they focus on specific campaigns. So, for example, there is a huge body of scholarship on the Peninsular War, as we call the conflict between France and Britain and Spain over the control and future of the Spanish and Portuguese monarchies. And there is, of course, a separate body of scholarship of Napoleon's own campaigns, whether in 1805 in Central Europe, or then 1806, 1807 in northern parts of Europe, and then, of course, more famously, Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and then his defeat and collapse of the empire. and that's the core of Napoleonic scholarship. That's what the vast majority of books are about. But ever since coming to the United States and then really devoting myself seriously to the study of Napoleonic era, I was a bit perplexed by it, but because this approach excludes a lot of territory and a lot of events that have been taking place during this period. So, for example, very rarely will you find in the traditional narrative of Napoleonic Wars a discussion of events even in northern Europe. So, let's say, struggle for the Scandinavia. That was a part and parcel of Napoleonic Wars, or discussion of events in Southeast Europe for this, events in the Balkan Peninsula. So that always perplexed me. And then looking more globally, the traditional approach has very little to say about how events in Asia, in Africa, or for me, more crucially, Latin America tie into this larger scope of Napoleonic Wars. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to craft this book, looking not just at Europe, as it traditionally has been done, but expanding the confines to cover the impact of Napoleonic Wars around the globe. To do that, of course, is a rather challenging task, because you are dealing with an event of very large scope, and in order to highlight its impact around the world, you have to, in many respects, to repeat the discussion or retread the path, so that to make sure that the reader stays abreast of events. So what I did is I structured this book both geographically but also chronologically. So we start, as you have mentioned, with the French Revolutionary Wars in 1792. And then initially we focus on events in Europe. So in that sense, the book follows the more familiar path. But once we reach Napoleon, especially his campaign in Egypt, which I believe was one of the crucial moments of this entire period, and certainly a crucial moment for the history of what we now call Middle East. Then we start branching out just a little bit outside Europe. So we move to Egypt, and then in the book I try to underscore that the campaign in Egypt had far wider ramifications well beyond Egypt itself, to Iran, to Oman, to Yemen, to India. And then we use that kind of approach to slowly expand the narrative and the coverage to include other parts of the world. And I try to do it in one chapter per region. So I have one chapter that I call The Western Question, which I believe, most of your listeners probably are familiar with the Eastern Question, but few might have dealt with this, what I call a Western Question of what would happen to the Latin American colonies, to Spanish and Portuguese possessions once the metropole, right, Spain and Portugal, came under French control. And then we have a separate chapter on Asia, a separate chapter on North America, and so on. And I think this approach, even though there is certain redundancy to it, since parts of those chapters hark back to the material that I cover in earlier chapters. But this way, it also makes the material self-contained, where if the reader is interested in just a regional coverage of what happened in the Middle East, or what happened in Iran, or what happened in India, they can deal with that chapter and reread it and get the information, all the information needed, without necessarily going back and rummaging through the earlier chapters.
Now, when you talk about the effects, the global effect of the wars, are you talking beyond simply maybe diplomacy or economics? Are you talking about military activity as well? Maybe civil wars or revolutions or other things like that?
Yes, sir. What I see here is the impact of Napoleonic Wars on several levels. Certainly, we can start with ideological impact. Now, it's not as pronounced in some parts of the world, but we can see that in places like Latin America, where the ideas of the French Revolution, the ideas of Napoleonic changes, let's say the Constitution of 1812 that was introduced, 1808, first introduced by Napoleon and revised by the Spanish liberals in 1812, that has the ideological impact well beyond Europe.
I'm speaking with Alexander Mikaberidze, author of The Napoleonic Wars. You can find more information on his Facebook page or on his academic page at Louisiana State University Shreveport. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast.
Besides the ideological, next point will be the political, diplomatic, and of course military, since Napoleonic Wars in their scale and intensity were the largest conflict the world has seen up to that moment. And what I mean by that is, yes, there was a 7 Years' War, and there was the War of Spanish Succession that had European countries fighting in various parts of the world. But in terms of its scale and reach, Napoleonic Wars dwarfed them. We see this war, actually military operations taking place in North America, in the Caribbean, in South America, in parts of Africa, and of course, parts of the Middle East, India, as far as China and Japan. So in terms of the scale, this is certainly the largest conflict the world has seen up to that moment. And in sheer numbers, especially when we deal with Europe, we see mobilizations on scale that are simply unprecedented. Mm-hmm. Think about the levée en masse that the French government issued in 1793, right, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of men. Or think about Napoleon's own mobilization efforts, or leading an army of some 600,000 men into Russia in 1812. These are astonishing numbers, certainly dwarfing anything that was seen in earlier eras, or in earlier decades leading up to this moment of this war. And then, so this is ideological, right? Political / diplomatic, military, and I do try to bring economics into this discussion. Mm-hmm. I would have loved to see more of it, but I think it would have made the book much longer and maybe more difficult to read. But economics are crucial to this, and to give your listener just a sense of it. Mm-hmm. Spain drew a lot of its money from the silver mines in Mexico and other parts of its colonies. Mm-hmm. And that silver sustained not just the Spanish economy, but it actually helped the French, because there was the mutual dependency between the French and the Spanish economy, especially when it came to silver. But it also came to have an impact on parts of Asia, as some of your readers probably know. Much of the silver that was mined in the Americas ultimately ended up in places like India, but especially China. But the Napoleonic Wars had an impact on the ability of Spanish monarchy to extract the silver, and most crucially to transport silver. And so that has then the ramifications for both a European economy and, of course, beyond that to China. Mm-hmm. Or I will remind your listeners about the constitution, about the continental system mm-hmm. that Napoleon tried to implement between 1806 and 1814. Now, some people confuse continental system with continental blockade. And what I try in this book is highlight that we are talking about two interrelated and oftentimes intertwined systems, but nonetheless, these are two different concepts. Mm-hmm. Continental blockade was Napoleon's attempt to isolate European economy from the British the fast industrializing economy. It was very hard to compete with the British because of that industrial capacity that Britain was fast developing. In fact, one of the core roots of the French, roots for why a revolution took place in France in 1789 was the economic issues, financial and economic issues, certainly, which were made worse by the French monarchy's decision to sign a free trade treaty with British in 1786, the so-called Eden Treaty, that opened French market to the British goods. And of course, those goods were cheaper and produced in much larger quantities than the French, and French companies found it very difficult to compete with the British. So Napoleon understood that, and he tried to isolate not just French economy, but the rest actually of Europe's economy from this strong competitor that was British industrial economy by creating this blockade. Now, it was not a complete isolation. In fact, if we read Napoleon's letters and his orders, he is very specific that he wants to continue to trade with the British. What he doesn't want is to buy anything from the British while allowing the British to buy European produce. So it's a more of a self-isolation where you try to dictate terms of engagement. Ultimately, what he had in mind was to draw the liquidity of the British species, right, of the currency, by forcing them to pay cash every time they came to buy European produce, while not buying anything that the British bought. So that's the blockade. But there is a bigger picture that I lay out in the book of continental system, and that was a much larger concept Napoleon had in mind of structural changes that he saw introduced within Europe, and then ultimately he wanted to expand that to the colonies as well. So to answer your question, the book does cover both ideology, politics, diplomacy, military, and economics. Now, one of the reviews that I received from an eminent historian of the French Revolution, Lynn Hunt, highlighted that I don't go into details on cultural and gender issues, and that's true. For no other reason but space. To cover the above-mentioned issues already has taken almost 1,000 pages. At those other levels, would have made this book double the size.
So, for this period, how important was the man Napoleon in everything that happened versus the situation in the world at this time?
That's a very good question, and my take, I think, is quite different from what has been written, I think, by my predecessors. And let me explain what I mean by this. To start with, I believe that the war was inevitable. And again, not to be this predeterministic, right? But France, at the end of the French Revolutionary Wars, France was in a remarkable position. It has managed to secure dominance in much of Western Europe. It was able to secure a buffer zone that stretched from Belgium down to Italy, and that gave it a tremendous power. The point I'm arguing in the book is that I cannot imagine any government in France, whether there was a Bonaparte or not, but any government in France that would willingly give up the acquisitions that it had made, or that France had made in the previous decade. So if we accept this framework that France was already in a position of power, even without Bonaparte being a first consul, then I believe that that situation would have made it more conducive to conflict, because France's dominance would have been quite difficult to bear for other European powers. We know that the Directory, the French government that was in charge from 1795 to 1799, pursued a very aggressive foreign policy. So that's before even Napoleon came to power in November of 1799. The Directory was very aggressive in pushing the boundaries of French republic, in creating the sister republics in Belgium, in Switzerland, in parts of Italy. So Napoleon, in that sense, came already to pre-existing situation where France was successful militarily, and France was able to throw its weight around. Now, what the uniqueness that Napoleon brings to this situation is that he's a very capable man. Right? Whether you like him or not, I think both sides, right, those who are very fond of him and those who can't stand him, admit and give him credit for his ability, both personal and organizational, to restructure the French government and make it very efficient and very hard to deal with. He's capable on the battlefield, certainly in the period from 1801 to 1807, he is virtually unstoppable. And that then transformed this paradigm of France being supreme in Western Europe to France being supreme in Europe. And that, of course, is a crucial element. So here, then, to answer your question, France was already in position of power. Mm-hmm. Whether Bonaparte would have been first consul or not, whether there was another general who had managed to come to power and there was no lack of ambitious men in France at this time, France would have retained its unique position, and that would have engendered tensions with other powers whose interests French have violated, especially Austrian. Mm-hmm. But Napoleon made the situation even more unique by a series of his victories, by his successes between 1805 and 1807 that transformed France into a continental hegemon. Mm-hmm. And that was really, really unique.
Now, to focus on the man himself, and I'm sure many historians have looked at this, but I want to get your take. Making himself emperor, what was the point of becoming emperor, and then what sort of effects did that have on everything you studied?
It reminds me of Beethoven, right? When he hears about Napoleon's decision to be an emperor, and he famously says to be a Bonaparte and to become a Napoleon, right? To be this general of revolution and symbol of revolutionary change, and then to go back to this traditional monarchical system. Mm-hmm. It is quite an interesting decision that Napoleon makes. It's a hard question to grapple with because this was not a popular decision, and when Napoleon crowns himself an emperor, there's a general who is in attendance at the ceremony in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and the general turns to one of his companions and he says, "To have lost so many men and to have a king back, right? What a scene." Mm-hmm. Napoleon had that streak. When he came to power through a coup. Mm-hmm. And he certainly used military authority to consolidate his power, and this monarchical tendency, or more, I would say authoritarian tendency that he had, is gradually increasing, so that it is a gradual progression from being a first consul to become a life consul, to a decision to secure your power by enshrining yourself into law as a monarch. Mm. He takes advantage of the reality on the grounds in France, and that is the population is quite tired of the revolutionary turmoil. Population is ready for order and stability, and Napoleon certainly comes to power on that promise that he will bring order and stability to France. He takes advantage of the relative docility of the French population. We see that, for example, in the referendums that he organizes, and the plebiscites, there is a lack of involvement from the people. In the book, I actually provide numbers, specific statistics to show the different plebiscites and how many people participate in them. And we see that on average, about a third of people actually bothered to go out and vote. And that allowed people, scholars like me to ask question whether the rest, the remaining 2/3 were just being lazy, or where they intentionally expressed their disapproval of the government by refusing to participate. But however you interpret, the reality was that those referendums took place, and Napoleon could use them to justify the constitutionality of his decision. For him, monarchy was a way of ensuring this law and order in France, to avoid this revolutionary turmoil. And this is where, when we talk about Napoleon, oftentimes he's portrayed as the revolution incarnate, right? We see that saying, revolution is over, I'm the revolution, that Napoleon supposedly said. But to me, Napoleon is not necessarily a child of revolution. In the book, I'm making an argument that the best characterization of Napoleon will be that he was the last of enlightened despots. If we look at his reforms, these reforms are, of course, informed by revolutionary rhetoric, revolutionary ideology, but the roots of those reforms usually go back to this enlightened despotism and the reforms that were introduced by monarchs like Frederick the Great or Joseph of Austria. These are the reforms that were rational. These are the reforms that were designed to increase the effectiveness, efficiency of state power. These were the reforms focused on tolerance, equality before the law. Napoleon introduces those reforms in France and makes them institutionalized. But what he does along the way is he constrains, and in many respects reverses the more radical aspects of the revolution itself. So that's where I don't see him as this revolution incarnated necessarily. He's the product of revolution because revolution opened the way for him to advance and rise to the very top. Right? Without revolution, he probably would have been just a junior officer in the Royal Army. But the revolution made his rise to generalship possible, and then certainly his takeover. But his revolutionary credentials, to me, are a bit suspicious. To me, he's a last of enlightened despots. And in that regard, when he becomes an emperor, it's this continuation and a reflection of that enlightened despotism. For the rest of Europe, in fact, the fact that his proclamation of empire is kind of reassuring. When I look into Russian diplomatic correspondence, the Russian chancellor at this time, Rumentsov, actually writes a memo to the Russian emperor where he says Napoleon becoming an emperor is actually quite good because it means that he will be tempering the revolutionary instincts, the revolutionary impetus. He has effectively become one of us. Now, not in the sense that he became divinely blessed ruler, but essentially he joined this monarchical club, and he will now be constraining the radicalism. And he's right in this. Napoleon, in many of his activities, is anti-radical, anti-revolutionary. Be it in, for example, in his relationship with labor, or in his, even in the reversal of the popular suffrage, or in his treatment of women. Right, women were relegated to this secondary position in a society under the empire.
Now, and I know this isn't a biography of Napoleon, but I'll ask one more question focused on Napoleon, which is, I see him as similar to Alexander the Great in that he just liked to go out and make war, but he was also very focused on science and discovery. They both seem to want to learn new cultures and see what was out there. Is that a fair comparison? And do you have any comments on that?
I don't see him as a warmonger, as he's sometimes portrayed. And I know there are my colleagues, especially my colleagues in Britain, who hold Napoleon responsible for the conflicts. I do make it clear that in my book that his policies didn't help, that him pushing the envelope didn't help in the outbreak of the wars, but there are other factors involved in creating this situation that sustained this conflict for 12 years to be precise, from 1803 to 1815, once Napoleon comes to power. Now, Napoleon has, on a personal level, he has this remarkable intellectual curiosity. He reads voraciously, both as a young officer and later on as an emperor. Your readers might be interested in perusing his correspondence. They will discover numerous letters that deal with his efforts to develop his personal library. For example, at the height of the empire, he demands a special portable library of several hundred volumes that will be later on expanded to some 3,000 volumes that were designed. They were specifically made of small size, so to be portable, so that he could take it with them on campaign. And he wanted them organized in categories, themes, history, geography, economics, so that while he's campaigning, he could read and enlighten and inform his opinions. So from that point of view, he's quite an interesting character, always trying to deepen his knowledge and improve. But from and that makes him, I think, very hard to deal with, at least while he's at his prime. So from 1801 to about 1810, he is at the best of his game and virtually unstoppable. But Napoleon was also a micromanager to a degree that is, to me, unprecedented. I mean, I find it very difficult to find other examples of a person who micromanaged things like he did. in writing this book, but also other previous books, especially dealing with Napoleon's invasion to Russia. You see this man presiding, not just leading this army that is colossal in size, right, hundreds of thousands of men, but also presiding over a massive empire that stretches from Spain to Poland, and from Denmark down to Croatia. And he, as an emperor, he's responsible for leading and making decisions of it. And alongside, he makes these micromanagerial decisions where he requests orders, detailed orders on various local issues. One order that I came across was that when he's in Moscow, he notices a small battalion sent in the wrong way in Italy, and he castigates the commander for doing this. Really, right? You are in charge of empire, leading this massive army in the middle of Russia, and you are caring about a few hundred men sent in the wrong direction? Or the famous example of him reviewing and approving the statute of a French theater, right, while stuck in Moscow. Now, this micromanagement has a negative impact because it essentially suppresses initiative in many parts of the French government and military. It's hard to act on your own when you know that this all-seeing eye of Napoleon, for Tolkien's fans, like an eye of a Sauron, right, is always following you and caring and paying attention to you. So there is always this apprehension: what would the emperor do, and how he will react to it. And that hampers the French war efforts, especially after Napoleon moves beyond his prime, and that is around 1812 and certainly 1314. He still has glimpses of his brilliance, but he's not the man of 1805 or 1806.
I'm speaking with Alexander Mikaberidze, author of The Napoleonic Wars. You can find more information on his Facebook page or on his academic page at Louisiana State University Shreveport. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. If you're interested in other kinds of history, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Why didn't, this is kind of a tangent, but why didn't the nobles of Russia just surrender and give in to Napoleon when he took Moscow? Why would they rather have destroyed the country rather than give up to Napoleon?
Well, because there is a national pride involved. There is ideological difference involved. There is a cultural difference involved, even though many Russian nobles were Frenchized, so to speak, right? They spoke French fluently. They certainly were part of this larger Europe-wide French cultural dominance. But what the War of 1812 did was to reawaken the more nationalist streak within the society. It was already there in earlier years, especially after Napoleon defeats Russia in 1805 at Austerlitz and then at Friedland. There is already this desire to avenge the defeats, and that desire only strengthens with time. And so that for example, by the time we get to 1809, there is already in Russian society concern that the emperor of Russia, Alexander, might be compromising too much with the French. For example, when Russia supported Napoleon's campaign against Austria in 1809, there was a huge outcry back at home among the nobles. One of the best Russian generals, Peter Bagration, on whom I've spent quite a few years working on his biography. Well, Bagration refused to take commission in the army to fight the Austrians, whom he considered fellow allies against the French. There is an outcry from the nobility, who, as the French ambassador reported, was, and I quote, as proud of Austrian victories as if they were our own. And everyone was enraged by the Austrian defeat at Wagram at the hands of Napoleon. Furthermore, the same French ambassador in St. Petersburg was actually noting, this is in the summer of 1809, that the state of agitation that spread in Russian society, I have never seen anything like it. In fact, in some circles, this stunned ambassador reported there was even talk of assassination of the emperor if he continued on this work, on this path of collaboration with the French. And my favorite quote that I found came from an old field marshal, a Russian field marshal, who writes, and this is a quote, "Whoever might rule Russia in the future, we, the noblemen, would manage to preserve our property, but the Romanov dynasty, if it continues its current policy, will lose everything it has." So here is already a talk of a possible change, with an individual change. You know, like the emperors of Russia tend to have accidents, certainly in the 18th century, or even dynastic, as Prozorovsky, the field marshal Prozorovsky, suggests. So there was no possibility, at least I don't see it, of a Russian nobility accepting Napoleon as such, or accepting this alliance, fully accepting alliance with France, not after what had happened, and certainly not after Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. And then it's a matter of national pride and prestige.
Though it seems that the nobles were willing to resist at the sacrifice of the merchants and the lower classes, that they would suffer more with resistance than if they just gave in to Napoleon. I
don't think I would agree with that. In that the nobility did suffer because, of course, the invasion despoiled noble estates as much as it did, right, in merchant class in cities. Now, Russia is less urbanized than Europe. Its urban population is much smaller, and the middle class is far smaller than in France, or even Britain or Netherlands, for that matter. So when the war began, the War of 1812 began, we see actually this spirit of resistance, this nationalist streak, embraced by almost all categories of people, from the peasants, from serfs, peasants, through the urban poor to the middle class, what we call middle class, or mещанство, as it were called in Russia, to the nobility. The imperial propaganda, of course, made sure that this happened. Any voices to the contrary would have been suppressed. But overall, I think the Russian society responded with the rejection of Napoleon, rather than accepting any possibility of collaboration with him. Let me note here that there were instances of collaboration. For example, there was a priest in what is today Ukraine that was collaborating, for example, with the French. There were certainly instances of local collaboration here and there, but these are isolated instances, not large enough to change something. And that's where I think there's a interesting debate of what might have happened, let's say, if Napoleon had issued a proclamation abolishing serfdom. Now that poses an interesting question of what if would the Russian serfs, right, be willing to embrace the foreign aggressor if that aggressor promises them freedom? Now, from the available evidence, I lean to say no. That, like in Spain, we see the population rejecting the tangible changes that Napoleon brought, not necessarily because they dislike the reform, but dislike the fact that they came with a foreign aggressor. And I think the same reasoning would have played out in Russia as well.
Okay. So, to step back at a global view, the results of the Napoleonic Wars, three things. What changes, or two maybe, what changes did they have on warfare and military structure and organization? And two, what changes did they affect more in diplomacy, economy, that sort of thing?
So if we look at the military changes, then I think those changes are more pronounced in Europe than they are outside Europe. You see attempts to expand these military changes outside Europe to various parts of the world, but they are not as pronounced. Now, what do I mean? The French Revolution has an impact on military affairs in terms of, for example, mobilization, right? The mass conscriptions. It has an impact on organization of the armies, for example, development of the combined arms corps system that the French lead at and that Napoleon brings to perfection with his Grande Armée in 1803, 4, and 5, which allows him to dominate the battlefields of Europe until 1811. And then this kind of changes, these reorganization of artillery, creation of corps system, and then all that is then borrowed in parts and pieces by other European countries. So we see reforms in Austria, right, in the wake of defeat of Austerlitz. We see Prussian massive changes, right, in Prussia in the wake of the debacle of 1806. We also see Russian military reforms from 1805 to 1811 that bring these armies more aligned with the French military changes. But outside Europe, it's a bit harder to see that impact as pronounced. Now, I think the biggest area where we see that happening is in the Middle East. Now, in the Ottoman Empire, for example, we see the military modernization progressing slowly, but nonetheless, establishment of new schools, attempts to create a Western style, a European style military. Sultan Selim III, for example, starts creating the new style force, as they were called, the Nizami Jadid forces, that were dressed in European style uniforms and trained in European style, and then organized in European style. So, and the introduction of these new style troops, Nizami Jadid troops in Ottoman Empire, however, caused a backlash. From the traditional elements in military and society. So in military, this would be janissaries. And in the societies, this would be the local elites, the ayans, or the religious leaders, the ulamas, who condemned the introduction of this alien, right, foreign, infidel concepts within the Ottoman Empire. Not necessarily because this overarching, this ideological view, but also because what it meant in practical terms. The strengthening of the Ottoman military with these Nizami Jadid troops would have meant centralization of states' power, would have made the state stronger, the central government stronger, and would have made it, would have brought it more stronger and more effectively to this on the local on the ground. And of course, for local elites, that was not something that they would have wanted, right? That jeopardized their own interest. We see a similar process taking place in Iran. For example, starting in 1807, there is an agreement between Iran and France. They both have a common enemy, Russia. And Napoleon agreed to provide military expertise and train Iranian army to better fight and resist Russian expansion and encroachment in the Caucasus. And indeed, a military mission was sent under General Gardin to Tehran, and they tried to start this process of introducing Western military reforms in Iranian military. But like in the Ottoman case, we see similar problems, resistance from traditional groups, and these reforms remain limited. After 1809, the French were forced to leave Iran, and they were replaced by the British. In fact, the British military mission was sent to continue the French reforms. And in fact, from 1809 to 1812, British officers continued to train Iranian army, and they were actually involved in a war with Russia in 1810, 11, 12. British-led Iranian military was fighting against Russia, which is quite interesting considering that Britain and Russia had a common interest in fighting French back in Europe.
Yeah.
These reforms, again, as I mentioned, were not as deep or as impactful within Ottoman or Iranian societies at this stage. They will be down the road, but that's the beginning. So that's just in terms of military. If we look at the events in North America or Latin America, these military changes are not pronounced yet. Far greater is the impact of Napoleonic Wars in terms of politics, economy. In terms of politics, we can see, for example, that it is during Napoleonic Wars and because of Napoleonic Wars that we see the collapse of the Spanish Empire and the emergence of these new Central and South American reality of independent colonies or increasingly independent colonies. That a process that will take a better part of a decade and will culminate right in mid 1820s with the emergence of those states like Argentina, Colombia, right, Venezuela, Mexico, that we still have with us today. Mm-hmm. In India, for example, we have also a very pronounced impact of Napoleonic Wars. Of course, the European presence in India predates Napoleonic Wars. We can see, right, starting with the Portuguese arrival in 1500, a growing presence of Europeans in India. But it is in the late 18th century that we see Europeans really starting to intervene in local Indian affairs and coming to dominate. And here, the British East India Company, of course, played a crucial role. It was able, during the 7 Years' War, to establish its foothold in northeastern part of India and in the area of Bengal. And as part of its struggle against the French, or as part of the British struggle against the French, to gradually expel the French from the Indian subcontinent. But by the time revolution came to France and by the time Napoleonic Wars began, the French still have presence in India, in places like Pondicherry, that is still under French influence. And more crucially, the local Indian states oftentimes recruited French officers to train their military. And that posed a threat to the British interest, the British East India Company's interest in the subcontinent. For example, when we talk about the late 1790s, oftentimes the British East India Company used the excuse of the presence of the French officers at the courts of these various Indian rulers as a justification for taking action against the states, arguing that these states are pro-French, that they are under French influence, and therefore they pose a great threat to the British interest in India. Hence why we have attacks on the Nizam of Hyderabad, right, when we have the Anglo-Mysorean conflicts. Later on, when Richard Wellesley becomes the Governor General of British East India Company in 1798, he writes an interesting memorandum in which he argues that the primary goal for the British East India Company should be neutralizing this French threat in India. And using this French boogeyman, Wellesley then goes on an imperial conquest, which I discuss in my book. Between 1798 and 1805, when he's recalled, Wellesley effectively lays the foundation for the British imperial presence in India, and he does it consistently by arguing that if we don't do it, French will do it. If we don't take over and force these local Indian states to trot pro-British line, Napoleon, French, they would do it. And so he takes these preemptive measures, giving the local rulers a choice. You're either with us or you are not, and if you are not, then we'll force you to be with us.
Mm-hmm. Who would you say, and this is a very subjective question, but looking before 1792 and then after 1815, and ignoring sort of the ups and downs within the period, what nations do you think came out the most ahead because of the wars, and what nations really suffered at the end of the day because of what happened?
I think the nation that benefited the most is clearly Britain. Britain came out far better out of the war than any other nation. To start with, naturally, the Napoleonic Wars played a huge role in this development of this national sense of who we are. Right? Think about Nelson's victories over French at Trafalgar and Aboukir, or the British exploits in Egypt, or Waterloo, right, or in India, right. It all played a very important role in shaping the national consciousness, this national awareness within Britain. But also, Britain emerged out of this war with probably the strongest economy of any European power. I don't even need to say probably. They did. This was the industrializing economy that was in far better shape than other European continental powers. Britain also benefited from the fact that we see the traditional imperial structures in Latin America and in Central and South America collapsing, which opened the ways for the British goods, for the economic interests. I would remind, for example, that when the Portuguese monarchy was forced to leave Portugal in 1807, it moved to Brazil under the protection of the British Navy. And then once it settled in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, one of its first decisions was to essentially give British the preferential treatment when it comes to commerce. And that, of course, opened the path to the British economic interest in the region. Same applies for the British efforts to enter what used to be the Spanish colonial markets that has been denied to it for a very long time by the Spanish royal policy that controlled very rigorously the colonial trade. But after Napoleonic Wars, Britain has the ability to enter these spheres, these economic zones, and to its benefit. I just mentioned India, right? Britain certainly emerged with a far greater footprint in India than it had before the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, British retained South Africa in 1815 as a crucial waypoint from Europe to Asia, which is quite important for conducting commerce. Mm-hmm. Now, second country that I would identify as coming on top is, of course, Russia. As Russia in 1815 is in superb position of influence. I wouldn't go as far as say as hegemony, but it certainly has a tremendous clout on the continent. Russia benefited from the Napoleonic Wars in terms of territory. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Russian Empire has acquired Finland. It acquired what used to be the Duchy of Warsaw, so most of Polish state, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as it used to be. It acquired Bessarabia from the Ottoman Empire in 1812, and it has consolidated its presence in my own homeland, in Georgia, which Russians acquired between 1801 and 1815. And as part of that acquisition of Caucasus, they fought successful wars against the Ottoman Empire and Iran. So in 1815, Russia is at the height of its power. I think that's not an exaggeration, right? Having your troops parading down Champs-Élysées and camping there was a tangible testament to it. Mm-hmm. Austria certainly benefited from the Napoleonic Wars, although I would say it, with qualification. Austrians suffered a lot during the Napoleonic Wars. They've suffered more defeats at the hands of Napoleon than most other nations. But they were able at the end of it to recover their positions and to benefit from Napoleonic Wars in terms of structural changes within the empire, but also within the Germany, since by the end it is German Confederation that Austria presides over. Same can be said about Prussia, and in fact to a greater extent, because what Napoleonic Wars did is serve as a catalyst for profound changes within Prussia. The debacle of 1806 showed that the current situation was untenable, that changes had to be done, and rather painful changes. And those changes were introduced because of the defeats. So between 1807 and 1813, we have that reform movement presided by Scharnhorst, Stein, and other Prussian reformers who made sure that by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Prussian state was in a better shape than it was before the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm-hmm.
I think France, Spain, Portugal, those countries and a few others that we can discuss if we have time, came out the worst. For all the success Napoleon have had, and oftentimes we forget this, right? Is that Napoleon is a loser. Ultimately, he lost, and France that he left behind was in a worse shape than the one that he inherited. In 1815, France is deprived of all the acquisitions it had made, territorial acquisition that it had made since 1792. Right, it's back to the old regime France boundaries. The one big legacy, however, that Napoleon left France was the reforms, the institutional reforms, the legal reforms that he introduced. Now, those stayed around, and that's to the credit of King Louis XVIII, that he understood the importance of keeping these reforms and continuing that legacy of structural changes that Napoleon and the French Revolution bequeathed to him, even though many of his supporters, right, the ultra-royalists, wanted to reverse them. Mm-hmm. Now, those stayed with France, and they continue to reverberate for decades to come. Mm-hmm. But France has lost virtually all of its colonies. After 1815, France is not a colonial empire. It is a defeated state really in search of its national identity, which is one of the core reasons, right, that we see those events play out, and including the revival of the Napoleonic dynasty in 1850s.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Just for the sake of time, I'll turn now towards your research. Can you talk about some of the archives you used to get your information from?
Yes. I tried to consult archives in as many countries as I could. So most of the research was done in three core areas, and that is British archives, especially National Archives at Kew, which in there I try to tap resources at the War Office and the Foreign Office, the areas that were particularly of interest to me. It is, of course, the French archives, and here I spend a lot of time in the French diplomatic archives at La Courneuve, in north of Paris, and as well as conducting research at the French military archives at Vincennes. And lastly, I did the research in Russian archives, specifically the Russian military archives, the Russian State Historical Military Archive, or RGVIA, that informed much of my discussion. I was able to utilize also documents from the Russian Foreign Ministry archives. I tried also to consult, and I was able to consult documents from Swedish archives, Spanish archives, some German, but I think the first three that I mentioned, the British, French, and the Russians, are the core, represent the core of the book's research.
Was it at all necessary to visit any of the locations that are included in the history, or is that when?
Yes, yes, I did. It's even though there is a great progress done in terms of digitization, the archives contain really mountains of material that I don't see being digitized anytime soon. French are quite good at this process. The French National Archives has quite an important digital footprint. They scan and make available documents, but this is just a little bit of this iceberg, really, that's out there. So I did spend a lot of time there. I did actually conduct research at the Austrian military archives, but I was unable to visit it myself. Instead, I hired a research assistant, a wonderful lady who spent hours working there. And what I would do is I would identify specific collections in the Kriegsarchiv in Vienna that I needed to consult, and I would tell her specifically what documents I needed, and then she would scan them and send them to me, and then I would sit at home and go through that. So in that way, it was economical for both for me not to go to Vienna, but also for her to make some extra income on the side.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you've written a lot about this period, a few books, but for this one, what was the most surprising thing you came across?
I think the scale of it. You think you know the extent of it, but once you start digging, you realize how much had happened at the time, and you also, by the end of it, you realize how much still needs to be done. As much as I wrote this book, right, and it's quite a lengthy tome, it barely scratches the surface, and there is. I think I wanted this book to be as a call to action for more transnational discussion and research. There is a lot of regional scholarship that is being done, but I think oftentimes that scholarship is isolated, and we need more discussion between these groups of scholars working in various areas, geographic or thematic, to produce this more cohesive narratives. So that's one area. And another was I think this tug of war that you see between the need for modernization and the desire to retain the traditional way of life. And that's the thing that we still are dealing with and we're still grappling with today. And I found that quite interesting, for example, to explore the Napoleon's attempts to introduce modernization in Italian or Spanish countryside, rural countryside, these conservative areas, and the backlash that he received to it, and then draw parallels, for example, for myself with what's going on with this modernization, struggle between modernization and traditional values nowadays. It's not just Napoleon who struggles with it, and British too. For example, one of the areas of research that I personally found quite revealing was the British efforts to bring changes to Sicily in 1810, 11, 12. Sicily is an island which is protected by the British Royal Navy, so French can't invade it. But the British also try to reform local society by bringing these changes that the locals are not particularly appreciative, even though they are, we can call, progressive from a modern point of view. So I found that quite illuminating and quite interesting to me. And then just digging in behind the scene discussions. For example, I found oftentimes myself just chuckling, reading Russian and the French correspondence and various plans that they had for restructuring Europe, partitioning Ottoman Empire. And you see these diplomats, right, sitting in a room or sending letters to each other and deciding fates of hundreds of thousands, millions of people without really much care for the interests or that these people have. For example, partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, they discussed it so many times without really pondering what were the interests of the local population, what was the interest of the Ottomans at stake, and I found that quite revealing.
Mm-hmm. Was there a question, a particular issue that you had a great deal of difficulty trying to get an answer to? Maybe you did come to a conclusion you were happy with, or maybe you still would like to get an answer?
There are many of them, and in some of them I'm trying to follow up in this ongoing research, current book projects that I have. I think one of the puzzling moments for me is Napoleon's stubborn refusal to make a deal in 1813. Just yesterday I was reading the Napoleon's downfall in 1814 and then his departure for Elba, and I was reading this report from an Austrian general, Köhler, and one of the moments Köhler asks Napoleon, that, hey, you could have made a deal with us in 1813 and the deal would have been quite good to you. You would have been still on the throne and you would have retained a lot of territory and power. And Napoleon, listens to him. He's silent for a moment, and then he responds with this interesting answer. He says, yes, well, back then I was cradled in my own dreams. And that kind of, I find that interesting because time and again in 1813 and then time and again in 1814, Napoleon has an opportunity to make a deal with the Allies. And time and again, he just casts it aside. He goes all out, gambles, and then loses. And for a man of his intellectual capability, from the man that I've come to know quite well at his prime, right, when he's really remarkable to observe him in action, to see then him act so irrationally and carried away by this idealistic or lofty ideal, it's really hard for me to grapple with. And then in the book I try to touch upon it, but it's not. I was not able to go into too much detail. So maybe down the road in another book, I might explore that a bit more.
Okay. Did you have any difficulties getting this book finished or published?
No. Well, yes and no. Yes, in terms of finishing. No, in terms of publishing. I was very, very lucky and privileged to work with Oxford University Press, which commissioned this book. And they were extremely patient and kind to work with. Back in 2010, late 9, early 10, I was discussing this book with them. And when we agreed on terms, they commissioned me to write it within 3 years. And I thought that was plenty of time. Mm-hmm. And then 3 years turned into 4, then 5, then 7. And Oxford was very patient with me every time I would write back and apologize and say, I'm sorry, I couldn't finish it this year. Maybe next year. They would say, that's okay, take your time. Ultimately, it took me 10 years, and they stood by me and accepted the final product with very little changes. So the final book is much, much longer than the one they had in mind, but they were very, very kind in not asking for major revisions to it. And so that's where I did struggle in terms of finishing it because I thought it would be a smaller book, more general, so to speak. But ultimately, I thought that to treat this topic with due respect and to highlight the complexity of this era, I needed to dig deeper, and ultimately we have this. But I was fortunate that I had to work with Oxford, and they were very nice to me.
Yeah, at 960 pages and 29 maps, I imagine the editing must have been a little daunting.
Again, I was very fortunate to have Timothy Bent, a great editor at Oxford, who really taught me a lot of things, both about the craft of history, because he nudged me in becoming a better writer, and I hope the book bears the evidence of it, but also by asking the pointed questions of why I did things or why is this necessary, and pointing out areas where maybe I was unclear or areas where it need to be fleshed out. So I benefited a lot from working with Tim, and I'm very grateful to him.
Cool. So what's your current writing project or future ones?
I have several projects that are underway at different stages of completion. The one big project is a group effort. Me and my colleagues are working on producing a multi-volume study of Napoleonic era for Cambridge, for the Cambridge History series, and it will feature contributions from over 80 leading scholars from around the world, and I'm privileged to be a volume editor for that one, and it's really a joyful experience for me to work with these esteemed historians. As far as more monographs, the one I'm working on right now is actually a new biography of a Russian field marshal, Mikhail Kutuzov, the great character from Tolstoy's War and Peace, but also a great hero of Russian military during the Napoleonic Wars, the man who defeated Napoleon in 1812. Unfortunately, There is not much about him in English. His last biography of his was published in English in 1976, so more than 40 years ago, and it is awful, to put it bluntly. So I'm hoping to write. I'm about halfway through it, and then once this book is done, I'm actually doing research right now, and we'll start writing on a topic that, to respond to your earlier question, a topic that I touched upon in my Napoleonic Wars book, but I thought it required a bit more, and that is how United States acquired Louisiana. Mm-hmm. The Louisiana Purchase is a famous event. All of us have studied in school, right? The whole 1.5 cents per acre, right? Mm-hmm. Doubling of United States. But virtually everything that is written about this event is from American point of view, and understandably so. But what I want to do is produce what I call Louisiana Purchase and international history, and to see the impact of that event, not just for the United States, but on Britain, on France, on Spanish Empire, to cast the confines of this traditional narrative to a more international dimension. And I already have quite an interesting, I think, new discoveries, so to speak, that will make this book fresh and interesting to the reader.
And when you mentioned that, I'm curious also, so that sounds fascinating, but also the Russians over on the West Coast, I wonder if, the expansion of the U.S., I forget what years, there were a fair amount of Russians there, I think. So I'm curious if there was an impact on their thinking as well, seeing the U.S. expand, westwards.
Absolutely. In fact, in the Napoleonic Wars book, I touch upon these competing imperial narratives that we see on the northeastern shores of the Pacific. Mm-hmm. The Russians have been present in Alaska since mid-18th century and have been making inroads into what is today Canada, the coastline of Canada, and then all the way to United States Northwest, exactly during this period. Mm-hmm. Your listeners probably remember that it is in the middle of this Napoleonic Wars in 1811, for example, that we see the establishment of the Russian fort in what today is San Francisco, right? Fort Ross. Mm. Or, for example, Russian efforts to penetrate Hawaii and establish Russian presence there date during the Napoleonic Wars, although they are ultimately unsuccessful. Mm. And indeed, this Russian presence along the Pacific coastline of what is today United States posed some considerable concern, in fact, for the Spanish, who had claims to it, for the British, who also made claims to it, and increasingly United States, especially in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis Clark expedition, which brought this understanding of what's out there. In the book, I touch upon the Nootka Sound incident that predates Napoleonic Wars, but is crucial to the story of this revolutionary Napoleonic Wars in this part of the world. And that Nootka Sound incident involved Russian, Spanish, British, and American interests all converging in this part of area around Vancouver. That is a good example of the impact of this European imperial rivalries on the remote corners of the world.
Wow, I would never have imagined Vancouver being connected to Napoleonic War history.
Well, revolutionary, but Napoleonic too. In fact, I would suggest this is one of those, again, the area, to respond to your earlier questions of what things you discover, and that is the experience of Hawaii during the Napoleonic period, especially towards the end of it, where we see these adventurers who make appearance, Russian adventurers who make appearance in Hawaii, and there is effectively a Cold War between Russians and the Americans over the control of Hawaii in 1815-16, where both sides are jostling for the control of the islands, and they send warships and armaments to shore up their area. So, which is quite an interesting moment in history.
Yeah. So where can people find you on the web? Do you have a web page or social media?
I'm active on Facebook. They can just simply look me up under my first and last name. I'm also present on Twitter, though not as actively. And I have a website for it, lsus.edu, and then they can just simply search my last name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very good at responding emails. I receive daily inquiries, and I'm always keen on hearing from people who have read my research and who have either comments or feedback or criticisms. Even I enjoy corresponding with people with shared interests. So please feel welcome to contact me.
I'll spell your name for anyone who wants to Google. Alexander is Alexander, and Mikaberidze is Mikaberidze.
That's right.
So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, just thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoy conversations like this, and I appreciate your time and effort.
Oh yeah, I appreciate your time as well. Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options as well to get great military history information. You can find links to interesting military history videos on my Facebook page, WarScholar. You can find links to interesting military history news articles, military history archaeology information, and academic information on my Twitter page, WarScholar. You can find photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez WarScholar. You can find my military history videos on my YouTube page, WarScholar 1945. You can also sign up for my newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new military history books being published. Thank you for listening.